In this lecture, we're going to cover the first method of creating forms in Angular, and that is via model-driven forms. By the end of this lecture, you're going to know how to create a HTML form with a dynamic select box control. And you're also going to know how to define a form model on your component and link it to existing HTML form controls. So whether we are building a template-driven or model-driven form, we need some basic form HTML to begin with. Now, in model-driven forms, contrary to what you might think, the HTML for our form isn't automatically created for us. With model-driven forms, we still need to write the HTML that represents our form and then explicitly link the HTML form elements to code on our component. So for our model-driven form, I've created a simple bootstrap form on a component with a selector of model form. It doesn't have much code in the component itself. We're just implementing on init, and I've created the ng on init handler there, which will flesh out later on. And we're just consuming the model form component in our main app component, and then we're just bootstrapping that via our ng module. So going back to our HTML form, just here, the first thing you should notice is that we've added the noValidate attribute to the form element. So by default, browsers perform their own validation and show their own error pop-ups. But since we want to handle the form validation ourselves from within Angular, we can switch off this behavior by adding the noValidate attribute to the form element. And just another quick note is that we're using the markup and styles from the Twitter Bootstrap UI framework to structure our form. So I've created a simple Bootstrap form with first name. So this is the first name input field here. It's wrapped in something called a form group div, which is just some markup and styling from the Twitter Bootstrap library. But this is the first name input field, last name input field, email input field, and we're also going to ask for a password and a language. And essentially what I'm implementing here is something that you might implement in a sign-up form for a site. So first name, last name, email, password, and perhaps language. If I run this, you'll see the form on the right-hand side. So first name, last name, email, password. And then we have a drop-down box for language. Now, there's no options in there right now. I have one option, which is just please select a language. But we want this select box to have a list of languages for the user to select. Now we could hard code the languages in the HTML with different option tags. Like so, but this doesn't make it so easy to add items later on. We're essentially hard coding the values and the logic of our application in our HTML. We want to make this list of languages dynamic so we can easily add more languages later on. So to support this, let's first add a list, an array of languages on our model form component. I create a property called langs, and it's going to hold an array of strings. And I add 3 languages to our array: English, French, and German. Let me remove my hard-coded options. I'll leave the initial please select a language option though. And now to render the other options, I'm just going to use an ng for loop, and I'm going to attach that to an options tag. So I create an option tag and then I use ng-for and I loop over each item in our langs array, and I'm going to refer to each item with the variable lang. Now an option has a label and a value. The label is the text the user sees in the select box, and the value is the data that's stored for that label. Now each item in our langs array is just a single string, so I'm going to use that for both the label and the value. Now let's start off with label. To set the label of an option, we just put some text in between the opening and closing option tags. So I'm going to put the language as the label here. And then to set the value for an option tag, we bind to the input property value. So to bind to an input property, we need to use a square bracket syntax. The property is value, so that's the property we're going to bind to. That's what we're going to put inside the square brackets. And I'm going to make that equal to just lang. So now if I rerun our application, I then click on the language select box, you can see now we see English, French, and German there as well. So that's how we create a dynamic select box in Angular. The next thing we want to do is we want to represent the form as a model composed of instances of something called a form group and a form control. So let's create the model for our form on our component. The first thing I do is I create a property called myForm, and this is an instance of form group and represents the form itself. And in my ng-on-init function, I actually instantiate my form group. Now, form group is some code that we need to import from a package in Angular. And it comes from the Angular/forms package. Now our form group takes as the first parameter an object, and this object lets us define all of the different form controls inside our form. So one of the form controls we have is email, so I'm going to add that. Now the value of email is something called a form control, so I'm going to create a new form control instance. And we have to import form control again from our forms package. As well as email, we also have the fields password and language. So let me add those as form controls as well. Now, the myForm property is an instance of a form group class, and this represents our form itself. Now, each form control in the template is also represented by an instance of a form control class. This form control class encapsulates a state of the control, such as if it's valid or invalid, or even its current value. These instances of form controls nest inside our top level myForm form group. But what's interesting is that we can also nest form groups inside other form groups. Now to explain that, let me have a look back at the template that we have for our form. So if you look at the first name and last name, you can see actually they are nested inside another tag called fieldset. So we then want to, in our form model, we want to nest first name and last name inside its own form group. So let me show you how we do that. I create a property called name. I then create a new instance of form group. I then pass to form group an object. And then I pass to that object the first name and last name as form controls. And just like a form control instance, a form group instance, such as our name instance here, This encapsulates the state of all of its inner controls. For example, this name form group is only valid if both of the first name and last name form controls inside it are also valid. The form group encapsulates the state of its innermost controls. And so you can see with the top level my form, that's just the form group. That's just encapsulating the state of all of its controls and all of its form groups. So the top level my form instance is only valid if all of the form controls inside it are also valid. So now we've created our form model. The next thing we need to do is we need to link our form model to the form template. Now to do this, we use a number of directives which are found in the reactive forms module. So let's import that and add it to the imports for our ng module. So we import reactive forms module. And we add that to the imports for our ng module. The first directive we're going to use is something called a form group directive. Small case f, form group. It's not the form group class here, it's a directive. We use it like so. We attach the form group directive to our form element. And then we pass into our form group directive our myForm instance, our model for our form. And now that we've linked the myForm model to the form template, we have access to our myForm model in our template. So the value property of the myForm model returns the values of all of the controls as an object. And we can use that with the JSON pipe to output some useful debug information about our form. So typically I like to add a pre-tag to the bottom of my form like this. In this pre-tag, I bind to myForm.value, which I pass through the JSON pipe. And I made a small mistake. It should be this.myForm. And now if I run the application, we see the form rendered on the right hand side, but on the bottom of the page we also see a JSON representation of the form. And initially this might seem quite exciting, but as we enter values into each of the input fields, we can see that the form model isn't getting updated. The values we see in the JSON representation at the bottom, they all remain null. And that's because although we've linked the form element to the myForm model, this doesn't automatically link each form control in the model with each form control in the template. We need to do this explicitly with the form control name and form group name directives. We use the form control name directive to map each form control in the template with a named form control in the model. So in our model, the email form control has been named email. So if we want to map this input control to our email model form control, we use the directive form control name and we pass it the name of the control that we want to map to on our model form. So let me add form control names for all of the other input controls in our template. Now there's a special case for our first name and last name form controls. Because they nest under another form group, a form group with the name, we then associate the field set element with the form group called name. We need to do that first. So the field set element is the HTML element which sits above our form groups. So we first need to map this to our name form group, and to do that we use the form group name directive. and we pass it the key that we want to map to on our MyForm form. And then again, for each of the input fields in our form group name, we then also add form control name directives so that it maps to the relevant form control. Now, the only caveat to nesting form groups is that in our template, the controls we want to group must be surrounded by another element. Now, we've surrounded our controls with a field set element, but it doesn't have to be called field set. It could be anything. For example, it could even be a div. And now if I rerun the application and I type into the form, so now that each form control in the HTML template is mapped to a form controls in our form model, as we type into the input elements, we can see the JSON representation of our form updating on the bottom of the page. So in this lecture, we created a form model on our component using the form group and form control classes. And then by using directives such as form group, form control name, and form group name, we linked our HTML form to our form model. Then, by using directives such as form group, form control name, and form group name, we linked our HTML form to our form model. In the next lecture, we're going to learn how to add validators to our forms to give visual feedback when the data entered is invalid.